Before talking about the Greek philosophers' political ideas and contributions themselves, from the outset it is important to note that while many of these figures were of some importance in their own day, the specifics of their ideas were not of much contemporary relevance. Only a few claimed to attempt to put their ideas into practice, and even those met with dubious success, assuming their attempts had been genuine. The greater importance is the impact they had on later generations, both in thought and application. The early pre-Socratic philosophers, and the Ionian Milesian school especially, that is, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, have not been well recorded by comparison to many later writers. As such, they may have had much to contribute, which we can no longer attribute to them. However, absent this evidence, we must conclude that their main contribution, relevant to us here, is simply an acknowledgement of the secularization which had taken place. They endeavoured to explain all processes via natural mechanisms, which, though effective in advancing the sciences, entailed an undermining of the legitimacy of the former divinely derived kingship. Anaximander himself, a naturalist more extreme than even many later thinkers from more secularized times, was perhaps tasked with writing a constitution, an act unthinkable to previous generations. For Anaximander, this was a conscious rebuke of certain monarchic and aristocratic traditions, instead promoting the demos as the core of political life. Others, like Heraclitus, seem to implicitly prefer the aristocratic tradition, but he raises up conflict as necessary for justice. Perhaps this was a justification for the ongoing factionalism of his time, stasis as it has been referred to previously, or perhaps simply the application of a higher principle. In either of these previous cases, we see a straying from the monarchic principle, either towards aristocratic discord or democratic hegemony, though both in practice are simply different types of legitimized internal conflict. Although some, such as Xenophanes, are beginning to apply the pressure which will hone the aristocracy in time, in his case by refraining from drink, but no doubt there is more, now lost to time. Moving from the pre-Socratics to the post-Socratics, we receive Socrates through Plato, laying out his cycle, or perhaps degeneration, of polities. This is because, to him, most fundamentally, the polities are expressions of the virtues and vices of the people inhabiting them. By extension, the degree of their understanding of the true nature of virtue, and justice in particular, in combination with their ability to channel and embody it. These qualities are, however, presented as downstream from the expectations and norms of the present, which eventually gives way to a different system. These systems in turn are monarchy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny. Terming them this way, however, is slightly misleading, as the main concern is one of virtue and happiness. As the government of the state descends through the stages, so too does the happiness and vice of both the rulers and the subjects. The first stage, however, may just as readily be a virtuous and ideally philosophically informed individual ruler as an aristocratic group of rulers fulfilling the same parameters. This is, incidentally, where all hope is found for instituting the ideal system. Briefly, it is worth noting here that the ideal system, or by implication monarchy, as distinct from tyranny, in general, is a state wherein men of the highest virtue and inherent quality are raised to the highest governing positions, dubbed the men of gold. Below them, the men of silver, who are the next most noble, suited for high offices, albeit not rule, with the remaining population stratified below that. Timocracy is the first degradation, where many of the men of silver are still present and effectively elevated to a kind of aristocratic rule, after the men of gold have been sidelined, exiled, or simply degraded from their former nobility. The timocracy, then, represents the afterglow of the rightly ordered state. It retains some portion of its course due to inertia, but it is afterwards subjected to an entropic degrading and bowing to the lower impulses of men. Eventually, inevitably, some portion of the aristocratic caste will be unfairly deprived of their property and inheritance through state power. They will learn from this that their virtues are no guarantees of the good life, which they otherwise enjoyed. Only power, and especially wealth, can guarantee that. This understanding, once discovered, will very quickly spread. Thus begins the oligarchy. The oligarchic government is the form most in balance, as the better men hold power, but they have been greatly reduced in noble qualities, and now seek largely just enrichment and maintenance of their wealth. Evermore they begin to indulge in pleasures and excess, but do so privately. In their quest for enrichment, they encroach as much as possible on the legal privileges of all but themselves, and extract as much as they can from the excluded poor. Two camps are necessarily created here, the rich and the poor, set against one another. Almost inevitably, if and when these two groups initiate a violent confrontation, the oligarchs will, if not at first, then eventually, have become too miserly to overcome the multitude through spending on mercenaries and bodyguards, and they will be displaced by the multitude. Democracy is in part created by, but also further cultivates, the democratic temperament, which is one of indulgence, liberty, and equality. The liberation from all authorities and binds is at first downstream from the oligarchic temperament, where excess wealth and the position of privilege afforded by such wealth is to be enjoyed on full display. Even after the oligarchs have been dethroned, the vices remain, and the emancipation of all from their duties only further encourages this trend of decadence. But the attraction is its own downfall. Equality in the public sphere comes to extend to equality in the private sphere. Traditional hierarchies are broken down in all quarters, between slave and master, husband and wife, father and son, tutor and pupil. To a great portion, this chaos and eventual apathy towards all laws and mores is the most intolerable state of affairs, and so they come to prefer and seek out the other extreme. This is found through tyranny. Democracy has its own peculiarities of structure. The city is split into three groups: the administrative elite, who are able to monopolize governance, the industrious elite, who gain and own the greatest amount of wealth, and the multitude constituting the rest. The administrators and industrious elite fall into conflict due to the administrators trying to extract too much from the industrious, but catch the wider population in the process. An opening is thus created for the theoretical power of the multitude in a democracy to be actualized through organization by a single champion. At first, he pledges to protect them, and confiscate and disperse the wealth of their rivals among the administrators and industrious elite, but will reserve a great portion for themselves. In fear for his own life, often quite rightly but still duplicitously, he requests and is granted his own bodyguard. Wielding the power of state, his own personal force, and acquired wealth, he is able to punish the enemies of the multitude, and resolve any other external issues which may require a strong leader. However, when he has done so, fearing for his position, he will continue to ensure that there is no viable alternative. He will create issues abroad to justify his remaining as leader, and institute crackdowns on any potential formation of a faction which may oppose him. The tyrant himself cannot coexist with any other man of note, and so all good men must be removed. No criticism can be tolerated, and so only flatterers surround him. Even segments of the wider population might be removed and replaced with more pliant loyalists. If democracy is the absence of virtue and education, then tyranny is the inversion of them, such that virtue becomes unattainable, and falsehoods are strictly reinforced. The whole state is bent to the vices of the tyrant, and the equality of all others in the state is completed by their total subjugation and enslavement to the will of the tyrant. Yet, through all the falsehoods and the access to all that he wishes, the tyrant is the most miserable, and his opposite, the king, is the most happy. Immediately, three things are clear. Firstly, that the primary node of concern is the individual, but not merely any and all individuals, specifically the most able. Another distinction of types is made between the leader and the follower, and it is clear that little concern is paid to the followers. Secondly, that the structure and nature of the state is reflected in the virtue and happiness of its best men. The exact sequence proposed is a reasoned simulation, but the core through-line is that the best men of the polity degrade in virtue, thus making the previous form unsustainable. But while the new form may be more suitable to the degraded quality of the men, it is not preferable for anyone, as justice is eroded and deteriorated at every stage. Thirdly, although there are many other forms than monarchy or tyranny, which is in practice merely a difference of vice or virtue in the monarch, they are transitory and fleeting. Perhaps we may say that so too are monarchic forms subject to this same degradation, but they are the only forms which are not self-defeating. Democratic equality, which wishes but cannot justify only partial equality, cannot be sustained. Oligarchy, which wishes to maintain wealth and power, but wishes to never part with any wealth to preserve it, is extremely brittle. Meanwhile, ultimate justice and virtue, or absolute vice and slavish subjugation, can sustain themselves theoretically indefinitely. The final underlying core is this, that there is no finer government than a monarchy ruled by the finest men at hand, tutored to perfection. The accepted term is the philosopher king. Aristotle's commentary deviates quite markedly in many places, but harmonises in others. Contrary to Plato and Socrates, he contends that man is an innately political animal, and as such, the foundational unit is actually the polity itself, filtering down to households and individuals. In this way, polities are fractal, containing subpolities within the polity. But to Aristotle, these are quite different from one another. This is because, similar to Plato, Aristotle states that there are two fundamental types: leaders and followers, masters and slaves. This is a natural distinction, and one which may or may not correspond to legal status, but all will be better off and happier if the natural order is respected. That is, if masters are given leadership and slaves are given proper direction. In regards to a wife and children, the matter is similar, but subtly different. Namely, that although men are better suited to leadership in general, his authority is not absolute, and nor is his advantage complete. So much as a political leader may have general but not absolute dominion, so does the man with his wife. In the case of children, the difference is not of type but of seniority. His advantage is absolute, but the close type and blood relations will encourage a benevolent direction aimed at elevating the children, and raising them up to be masters in their own right. For these reasons, then, although the exact nature of the direction will be different for different members of the household, the governance will always be monarchical, if it is to be in accordance with nature. The master of the household is the only natural master, and thus rules as a monarch. Before continuing, it is essential to define the constitution in this context as simply the way things are done. It may exist as a coherent document, but it need not necessarily be so, as long as it is generally understood and adhered to. A city, or more general polity meanwhile, is subject to different rules to the household. Fundamentally, this is because of the more homogeneous nature of the constituent masters and freemen. As such, all questions beyond this are more so differences in constitutional preference, rather than natural necessities. How citizenship is spread and attained, how offices are apportioned, how justice is dispensed, and how laws are devised. All these matters are particular to constitutional preference. In turn, all of this means that although there may be a model citizen conforming to the perfect ideals of the Constitution, this is a construct which may or may not, and indeed often is not, in line with what makes a good man. The perfected Constitution, therefore, is the closest alignment of the good man and the model citizen. With all this in mind, Aristotle identifies 6 forms of governance, 3 in which the interests of the polity are preeminent, and 3 in which the interests of the ruling body are preeminent. These are then divided into rule by one, rule by a few, and rule by the multitude. These are noble kingship and ignoble tyranny, virtuous aristocracy and vicious oligarchy, just constitutional government and unjust democracy. A principal unifying factor behind the 3 preferable models is that no particular group or individual is above the law. Edge cases not covered by the law may be ruled on however the Constitution stipulates. Position and influence in the polity must be in accordance with contribution to the polity, not necessarily directly in terms of deeds done for the government, but the totality of political and social life. As such, men of virtue and accomplishment should hold sway in a just polity. In some sense, this is downstream of the open-ended egalitarianism implicit in Aristotle's conception of the polity, as a heterogeneous community of interdependent men who, in turn, form their own households. They each have their realms, but among one another they are relative equals, though to what degree is the contention. Therefore, in respecting this open-ended political arena, the 2 best outcomes are as follows. Either expertise and good qualities are dispersed sufficiently among the citizen population that they ought to be deferred to, even if, and perhaps ideally, only selecting from a number of notables or experts to fill offices, thus invoking the wisdom of the crowd. Else, a single man is sufficiently good and capable that he must be made king. In all of these types, a range of options and gradations is presented, but the core divides are these: between the constitutional or limited monarch and the absolute monarch, between democracies which are underpinned by inviolable laws, those which have land qualifications and concerns as a requirement for participation, and those which are purely populist, between oligarchies or aristocracies that are based on wealth alone, and those which also make allowances for merit, between tyrannies which aim for the public good and those which are purely aggrandizing for the tyrant himself. The constitutional government type is considered a mix of democratic and aristocratic features, attempting to make allowances for the expertise of both groups, and it may also be implied that a constitutionally regulated monarch has a place in such a system. This would combine all three fundamental forms, should there be a sufficiently qualified man or family to take on this mantle. Similarly, however, although absolute monarchy is typically not preferable according to Aristotle, there may be cases where the discrepancy in expertise is so great that to invest absolute authority in this most capable man would produce the most optimal outcomes. In any case, the promotion of foreigners as a base of support, especially as a bodyguard, is to be strictly avoided as a measure which is, according to Aristotle, only suitable to the basest tyrants. The government types also correspond to particular population segments, though sometimes there can be some blurring of the membership. Democracy is the preserve of the poor, oligarchy of the rich, and aristocracy or constitutional government of a proposed third middle class, which possesses the typical vices of neither class. As stated, however, certain oligarchs may align themselves with the poor as a champion. Such is often the way tyrants rise. And similarly, an oligarch may be disgruntled by temporary impoverishment, while nonetheless remaining in alignment with the oligarchs after having already secured his privileges in the state. All of these forms are vulnerable to factionalism and internal conflict, previously referred to as stasis, though the origin of the discord differs. Typically, in a tyranny or monarchy, it will be some sort of envy, foreign intervention, or arbitrary rule. Under an oligarchy, it will be excessive belittling or oppression of the poor or interpersonal rivalries. While under democracies, it will typically be the intervention of demagogues, or excessive wealth and property confiscations. In all of these cases, the likely end result is much the same: dissolution of the constitution into a different form. The good constitution is one which encourages the growth and thriving of the good man, and both are intimately connected to the pursuit of the good life. While relative equality and a distribution of skills and expertise pervade the polity, relative equality under the laws should be maintained. But where there are greater discrepancies between the masses and the prosperous and the virtuous, this must be enshrined in the constitution. If there exists one man or family who towers over the rest in virtue and capability, he must be made king. And if he is sufficiently great, he must be made an absolute king, and thus raised above the law. Aristotle believed the necessity for this to be much reduced compared to in the past, due to the general improvement and independence of the Greeks compared to barbarians and their own predecessors, but he is rightly still open to the possibility. Xenophon takes the Aristotelian approach to elevating a monarch to a natural conclusion by way of historical example. Using the life of Cyrus as an example, he demonstrates the heights that the state may reach with such a leader, but also some notable pitfalls. Common to Greek perceptions, the Persians are described as a servile people, ordinarily unable to rise to the heights otherwise achieved by the Greeks. However, Cyrus's outstanding competence is able to not only compensate for this, but allows him to build a grand empire in just his lifetime. He is viewed and views himself as a father figure to all his subjects, and compared to the Greek context, especially using the frame of Aristotle, this observation gains more significance. The whole state has been structured like that of the household, rather than a polity or a polis. As part of this, there is no explanation to be drawn from analysis of the Persian constitution, or any structural explanation. Only the genealogy and life of Cyrus himself can explain the explosive rise of the Persians. But therein lies the downfall. Within the Cyropedia, Cyrus cautions against the inevitable degradation after his death, but without leaving firm constitutional or institutional structures. And because the weight of all matters of state were upon his shoulders, not only is there a lack of clarity as to who may succeed Cyrus, but so too is there a lack of candidates up to the task. The state had been structured around the individual personhood of Cyrus, and so his death was its undoing. In accordance with both Aristotle and Plato, Cyrus is by far the most virtuous and qualified man among the Persians, and so it is both prudent and just that he be given the title of king, and absolute authority to rule as he saw fit. Xenophon builds on this by suggesting that the slavishness of the Persians is accentuated and reinforced by Cyrus, rather than tempered by a moderating constitution. though in part this is unfair due to the supposition that the constitution of an absolute monarchy is dictated by the character and capabilities of the monarch, or original monarch in question. As such, the Persians perhaps gained certain expectations based on the extraordinary organisational talents of Cyrus, which persisted after his death to their detriment. The ideal democratic man, contrary to many other writers, is not so different for Xenophon. Unusually, he permits them their own pursuits of greatness, and their own aggrandizement. So too is he less scathing about interpolis bonds of friendship. All of this because these things can aggrandize the city as well as the man. The only requirement is that they continue to honour the laws and constitution of the democratic city. In his case, this is perhaps in part due to his own experiences which, according to many other writers, mark him out as a danger to democracy and the polis. He does have other, more practical concerns, however, as he recognises that the quality of men varies vastly, and that justice demands that their contribution to the polis be rewarded in due proportion. This necessarily means a stratification, regardless of the espoused principles of the democracy, but may be necessary for it to continue to enjoy the efforts and loyalties of its greatest sons. In this context, both for Xenophon and Aristotle, the demanded loyalty to law and the constitution may be seen as wise deference to the judgments of better men. If, however, a man emerges who is manifestly better than the laws which attempt to rule over him, it is right that he should be king, and rule absolutely. Perhaps deliberately, or by oversight, Xenophon permits all the elevation that would bring a man to the threshold of becoming a tyrant or king, but forbids actually crossing it. But of course, by that time it would be too late to stop it, so he only has moralizing to prevent it. Isocrates, meanwhile, though differing from the other figures mentioned in being primarily a rhetorician, is a valuable figure for illustrating changes in the late classical Greek mindset. This is perhaps more contentious, however, as his endorsement is more implied than stated. But it is not necessarily surprising, given that he is writing primarily for an Athenian audience, and thus one which is distinctly anti-monarchic, albeit by the time of Isocrates, the cult of Theseus has greatly softened this position. Though it is also worth noting the irony in this whole examination, being that all of these writers are primarily concerned with an audience dominated by democratic sentiment, and sometimes with the legal sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. Perhaps they would be softer, and indeed perhaps other writers in other cities now lost to history would be softer, were they not writing in this context. In any case, there are two main virtues of monarchy presented. The perfected ideal of the virtuous political man, that is to say, acting in service of the polis, in the form of Nicocles of Cyprus, and the necessity and virtue of a single unifier of the Greek world against external threats and enemies. In both of these cases, it may be that there is no necessary entwining with monarchy, and especially in regards to his ideal of a grand reconquest, it may not even have been his first choice to approach Philip of Macedon with the proposition. But as a pragmatic political operator, his vision came first. In the case of the idealized Nicocles, listing his many accomplishments and improvements to the life of his people, in all likelihood he implicitly had more to say about his compatriots in Athens than he did about distant monarchs. Indeed, his political activities seem to have often centred around using his rhetorical skills to support the potential great men of his day, especially from being smeared or persecuted by the Athenian mob. What both of these points have in common, however, is an orientation upwards from an internal core. There is little concern for internal conflict and discord, or wrangling for power and scrutinizing. There is only the ordering of the internal towards external goals. In both cases, the audience is bid to rise beyond what is usually considered possible. In his entreaties to Philip, likely read by his son Alexander, he goes a step further, not only bidding him to unite the Greek world in conquest of Anatolia for the betterment of all, but beyond that all that would be left is to become a god. Auspicious words indeed. In all these cases, a clear through line presents itself. That of the greatness of one man, if demonstrated, cannot be ignored. Justice demands that he be crowned or exiled, because greatness cannot pretend equality with mediocrity. Some see positive opportunity in the king, whereas others do not question its possibility, and only lament what might come later. In that sense, the argument openly made by most of them, that democracy and checked power is preferable, is contingent on the idea that it is extremely rare for a single man to be so completely set apart from his compatriots. This is an extremely convenient and rhetorically both popular and useful supposition, while also giving themselves the out of supporting a sufficiently capable man to take absolute power, while remaining completely consistent with their ideas and texts. And while the extent of the influence these figures had on the development of their states in their day is an open question, their ideas were absorbed and presented by many later figures as justification for their positions, or even as a guideline for how a state ought to be organised. So while they might at times exist alongside a historical trajectory that seems to give them only superficial attentions, these philosophers leave a much clearer mark on later history.